There's an idea most people in Britain accept, or at least hope is the case, that this is a tame country, that even the wild bits are managed, that the woods have been walked through, the moors are mapped, and anything large enough to matter, thanks to excellent and extreme prejudice against every single one of our large carnivores, now lives somewhere else. But what if I were to tell you that's just an illusion? That there are valleys in mid-Wales where you can walk for a day and still not see another person? That there is forestry plantations in the Scottish borders where the canopy is so thick the ground beneath it doesn't really know what season it is? That there's old Ministry of Defence land in Norfolk and Wiltshire that has been left to itself for the better part of a century? And that there are some hedgerows along the Devon and Cornwall border that connect woodland to woodland for miles without ever needing to cross open ground. Britain is certainly smaller than people from larger countries assume, but it's not without its remote and wild places. Places where things can hide, survive, and maybe even thrive. And that includes things that maybe shouldn't be here at all. For now, we'll leave the wallabies, kookaburras, and even raccoons for another time, because today we're going to look at one of my favourite subjects, Britain's big cats. But first, to understand why people in Britain keep reporting big cats, and why those reports refuse to fade in the way most folklore eventually does, we have to go back further than most accounts begin. And that means not to 1976, which is where the popular version of the story starts. In fact, reports and accounts go back much earlier than that. For instance, on the night of the 20th of October 1816, the Exeter Mail Coach was attacked by a lioness outside an inn called the Winterslow Hut in Wiltshire. This is not folklore. It was reported in the Salisbury and Winchester Journal and illustrated in a painting by James Pollard the following year. And the lioness, having mauled the lead horse, was later recaptured by the owner of Ballard's Travelling Menagerie, who had been overnighting nearby. Now, two things are worth noticing about this. First, that a fully grown African lioness was loose in the Wiltshire countryside in 1816 for several hours, and the only thing that prevented it killing the coachman was a blunderbuss and a very brave guard. Secondly, it's that it had got there in a wooden cage pulled by horses as part of a tour. We know that Britain has been quietly importing exotic predators for a long time. The Tower of London kept lions and leopards from the 13th century onwards. And the Romans likely brought them with them to fill amphitheatres long before that. We also know travelling menageries crisscrossed the country throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, often with minimal containment. And as we've seen, escape wasn't impossible. Even Allied troops from the US reportedly brought mascots in the form of mountain lions during their stay here in World War II, with not all returning whence they came. And after the Second World War, things didn't slow down, they shifted. By the 1960s and early 1970s, exotic pet ownership in Britain had reached its peak and it was effectively completely unregulated. You could, in principle, walk into Harrods and buy a leopard cub, and many people did. Lions, pumas, ocelots, lynxes, and the ubiquitous black panther, melanistic leopards, became status symbols, curiosities, and sometimes even security features. And many were bought by people who generally had no idea what these small, cute cubs could grow up to become. In October 1970, in Sutton, Surrey, an 8-year-old boy called James Tyler was attacked by a privately kept female puma named Tara. He survived after 38 stitches to his face, neck and throat, and really only because a passing labourer beat the puma off with an iron bar. The incident was raised in the House of Lords 3 days later, and it was 6 years after that, in 1976, that the Dangerous Wild Animals Act was passed. And this is where the popular version of the story usually picks up. But I think it's worth being precise about what the Act actually did, because the simple version misses what matters. The obvious thing to state is the Act didn't ban exotic pets, but it did make keeping them onerously expensive. There was 24-hour supervision, purpose-built enclosures, liability insurance, and local authority licensing. Suddenly, the puma you'd bought as a cub was a long-term financial commitment with no resale value in a country where the people who might once have taken it off your hands were now also priced out. And so, almost without avoidance, animals were released. Not all of them, of course. Many were quietly handed over to zoos. But it says something that there simply weren't enough zoos or spaces to meet the sudden influx and demand. And here's another detail that the popular version tends to skip. Releasing an exotic animal into the British countryside was not illegal until 1981, when the Wildlife and Countryside Act came in, which leaves a convenient 5-year window from 1976 to 1981 in which an inconvenient leopard could be driven to a quiet stretch of Exmoor and allowed to walk off into the dusk. And that's without anyone breaking the law. And this was seemingly exactly what Mary Chipperfield allegedly did, following reports from 2016 that she released 3 pumas during a transfer from Plymouth to Dartmoor Zoo around about 1978. Those 5 years between 1976 and 1981 may not be a long time in human terms, but it's long enough for several healthy breeding age cats to enter a landscape where they are more than physiologically capable of surviving it. And it's not hard to imagine that releases handily topped up that population throughout that period. And once there, both leopards and pumas can live for up to 20 years in the wild, although I realise that's the extreme estimate. But depending on the starting age of those releases, that potentially takes us comfortably into the early 2000s for the originals, and into our own decade for any offspring they may have produced. But let's reground ourselves back at what we actually know. And this is the part of the story where I think some channels and podcasts in this space tend to get things slightly wrong in both directions. Because I think we need to consider that there are 2 separate claims being made about British big cats, and they're almost always treated as one. The first claim is that non-native big cats have been at large in Britain in our living memory. The second is that they are breeding here in numbers sufficient to constitute a self-sustaining population. And we need to recognise those are not the same thing, and also that the evidence for each is genuinely different. Let's deal with the first one because it's easy, it's settled, it really is. There's no question. In October 1980, a Scottish farmer named Ted Noble caught a puma in a cage trap on his land near Cannock in the Highlands. He'd built the trap himself and he baited it with offal. This was after losing livestock and seeing a large cat regularly stalking his ponies. The animal was undoubtedly real because she got caught in the trap. She was christened Felicity and taken to the Highland Wildlife Park, where she lived for another 5 years peacefully and very loved by her keepers. If you've read my first novel, Shadow Beast, you'll be familiar with Felicity, as she's mentioned very early on in the argument for big cats existing in the UK. After her death, she was preserved by a taxidermist, and the Highland Wildlife Park explicitly requested that she was depicted with a calm and serene stance and expression to reflect her gentle nature. And you can go and see Felicity still today in the Inverness Museum and Art Gallery. But Felicity's case is complicated and worth being honest about. We must recognise that she was extremely tame and therefore almost certainly hand-reared and probably dumped rather than being a long-term wild resident. And There are even suggestions, never proven, and not ones I necessarily give substance to, that she may have been planted in the trap. Now, the reason I don't think that's likely is because Dr. Hans Kruk, who analysed her faeces just a few hours after capture, found evidence of recent meals of deer, rabbit and sheep, which, if you put one together, sounds that she's arrived in the landscape and been hunting. But Felicity is not the only one. In 1993, a leopard was shot on the Isle of Wight after killing chickens and ducks. In 2001, a Eurasian lynx was captured alive in Cricklewood in North London. She was an 18-month-old female, already considerably larger than a domestic cat, and she was named Lara. That's right, Lara the lynx, because all big cats in the UK must conform to alliteration, beast of Bodmin, etc. She ended up in London Zoo and lived happily ever after, we think. There have been other recoveries, including animals that escaped from licensed collections. DEFRA confirmed in 2016 that they had logged at least 27 such escapes from zoos or private collections since 1975. So the first claim that non-native big cats have been at large in Britain is not really a claim. It's simply now a matter of record. But the second claim is harder, and it's where the honest contemporary conversation lives and occasionally evolves. And I think that's a good thing. In 2022, on a farm in Gloucestershire, a sheep was killed in circumstances that didn't fit a fox or a dog attack. The farmer there had reported similar incidents before, going right back to 2017. In one of those earlier cases, the jawbone of a ewe was examined at the Royal Agricultural University in Cirencester, and the tooth marks were considered consistent with the molars and premolars of a big cat. In the 2022 incident, a documentary team led by Matthew Everett recovered a black hair caught on a barbed wire fence at the kill site. The sample was sent to a forensic laboratory for mitochondrial DNA testing. And the result was a near unanimous 99% match to Panthera pardus, a leopard. This is the case that anchors the documentary Panthera Britannica Declassified, one I'd recommend, and it deserves to be taken seriously. It also deserves to be taken with the caveats that any honest piece of forensic evidence requires. Mitochondrial DNA testing can confirm species, but it can't confirm an animal was alive in the vicinity, only that its hair was there. And environmental contamination is always the question in cases like this. And a single hair, however well tested, doesn't tell us how many cats there are, what their relationship is to each other, or how long they've been there. What it does do, and this is the part the sceptical position must grapple with, is move the conversation from is there one to how many and how long have they been here? Because, after all, hair samples don't fall off animals that don't exist. And here's where I want to bring in something the broader debate doesn't talk about enough, and that's how cats actually behave. I've been lucky to spend a little time around some of Africa's larger felids in the wild, and beyond that, I've observed many in captivity and worked with organisations championing their conversation in the landscapes where they live. I also like to think I've absorbed a lot of the literature and considered the subject very carefully. And when you've done those things, there are a few things which you begin to notice. The first obvious thing is that big cats are not like dogs. They don't form coordinated groups, except in the specific case of lions, which I think we can comfortably set aside here. But pumas and leopards are solitary, territorial, and crucially wide-ranging. They also just happen to be two of the most adaptive cat species known, conquering habitats from the Andes to Siberia and from Arizona to the Namibian deserts. A male leopard in good habitat can hold a territory of 50 to 100 square kilometres. And for a puma, it's considerably more. That means that even a very small number of resident animals, let's say a few dozen, spread across Britain's wilder counties, would not necessarily produce a uniform sighting map. But you would perhaps produce clusters, a series of hotspots separated by long periods of nothing. Sightings concentrated in particular valleys, then drifting north or west as a male moved on, or as a female with cubs shifted her range. Which is, interestingly, exactly what we see, at least generally and to a certain extent. These are places like Exmoor and Bodmin in the southwest, the Scottish Highlands, particularly the Cairngorms Fringe, the Cambridgeshire Fens, the Welsh borders. Little pockets, but not necessarily a uniform population. The second thing you notice, and this is where the livestock evidence becomes more interesting than it first appears, is how cats kill. Feral and loose dogs tend to harass prey, driving them and biting at the hindquarters and flanks. Cats stalk, ambush, and go for the throat or the back of the neck. With larger prey, they often cache the carcass, sometimes by dragging it onto cover, sometimes by hauling it onto the lower branches of a tree. This is something domestic dogs simply cannot do, and of course foxes can't either. Our reports of livestock kills in Britain matching this signature do not come from just one or two unreliable observers. We need to recognise that they come from gamekeepers and farmers, people whose livelihoods depend on being able to read tracks and carcasses correctly. The third thing, and this is where I'm going to be more careful because it's where the evidence gets harder, concerns deer. Britain currently has somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million deer. It's our highest population in over 1,000 years. To stabilise it, we would need to cull between 500,000 and 750,000 animals every year. Whereas in truth, realistically, we're culling about 350,000. So that means the population is continuing to grow. And that means that even if there is a small population of leopards or pumas in Britain, let's say 50 or 100 animals, which I think would be on the high end of any honest estimate, they would not be making any dent at all in the national deer population. I think it's important to be clear about that. Big cats are not going to control the overall British deer population. But, and this is the more careful point, what a small big cat population might do is produce localised behavioural changes in deer. You might start noticing how they use cover differently, how they choose different bedding patterns and times of day. They show a wariness in particular valleys that you don't see in others. And those are the kind of things that don't show up in national statistics, but which experienced stalkers and gamekeepers are beginning to remark on. I want to be honest about the limits of that argument. It's not evidence, not in the hard sense. But it's a signature you'd expect to see if there were big cats in particular places, and which some people in those places are beginning to say they are beginning to see. There's also one more complication which I think the British big cat conversation handles badly when it handles it at all. And that's the case of the callous cat, which again, if you're familiar with a shadow beast, you'll have heard of. Callous cats are a documented hybrid between Scottish wildcats and feral domestic cats, found particularly in northern Scotland. They're substantial, considerably larger than a house cat, and they're black, muscular, and capable of looking at from a distance and in poor light, very much like a small panther. They are not a myth. They were formally described in 1984, and they almost certainly account for some, not all, but some, of the black panther sightings in Scotland, and perhaps the north of England. I'm sure they could breed and spread quite easily. But that means the honest version of this story isn't just, are there leopards and pumas in Britain? It's more a mix of what things are out there and how do we tell them apart. Some of what people are reporting are undoubtedly misidentified domestic cats. Some, as I've suggested, are careless hybrids. But at least some are exactly what they look like and what witnesses are claiming them to be. I'm sure of that. There's also something specifically British about this phenomenon, and I think it's worth saying out loud. This is a country that has removed its large native predators centuries ago. The last wolf in Britain was killed in the 17th century. By then, the lynx had already been gone for over 1,000 years, and bears kind of disappeared somewhere in between. And what we've built in their absence is a landscape that looks, from above, completely civilised. We have cities, roads, industrial centres, a country with no apex predator other than us. But that's not the whole picture. 80 to 90% of the UK is considered rural, and only between 17 and 20% of the population lives in those areas. Woodlands and forests cover approximately 14% of our land, which increases to 15% in Wales and 19% in Scotland. And between 11 and 15% is moorland. 3% is made up of marshes, fens and bogs, a vital habitat we've unfortunately lost 90% of in the last century, but still part of the network of wild refuges in the UK. And nearly 25% of the UK is considered mountainous or upland habitat, and almost certainly some of that overlaps with moorland. But the point is, as a country, we're wilder than you think. And thanks to our elitist overlords, only about 8% of it is accessible to the public. Then, in the space of about 30 years during the middle of the 20th century, we've privately and chaotically reintroduced predators. Not through conservation, but through fashion. Through the exotic pet trade. Through travelling menageries and aristocratic collections and people who thought a leopard cub would impress their friends. And then we made it illegal to keep them. And, for a critical 5-year window, we made it perfectly legal to release them. It's hard to imagine a more efficient way to seed a country with apex predators while telling yourself you haven't done it. For me, I think the question of whether non-native big cats live and die in the British countryside is settled. They do. We've allegedly had the bodies, we have DNA, and we have living animals that have been captured. None of that is folklore. It's, frankly, record. I think the question of whether they are breeding in numbers sufficient to constitute a small but genuine population is genuinely open, and I lean towards yes. I accept that it may be not in great numbers, maybe not enough to register on a national scale, but certainly enough that in certain landscapes the sightings are consistent and perhaps even increasing. And I think the third question, the one nobody quite asks, is the most interesting, which is whether we actually want to know. Because if there really is a small breeding population of big cats in the British countryside, then the official position that there isn't becomes increasingly difficult to hold. And the consequences for admitting it, for landowners, for farmers, for insurers, for all of the people who would suddenly have to decide what to do about it, are genuinely awkward. I'm not sure that the lack of official investigation is a lack of interest. It's more likely a quiet preference for not knowing. Either way, somewhere in a Devonshire valley tonight, or a Welsh forestry plantation tomorrow, or a patch of Scottish woodland next week that no one has walked through in a decade, something might be moving through cover it isn't supposed to be in. It will be hard to see. It will not announce itself. And If you happen to be there when it passes, you may spend the next 20 years trying to convince people of what you've seen. Believe me, I know. Thank you as always for watching. I really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But for now, join me again very soon, and bye for now.